Early December 1941. The world has stopped and frozen at the gates of Moscow. For Lieutenant Hans Vogel of the 2nd Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, victory has a tangible shape. Through the frosted optics of his binoculars, beyond the veil of swirling snow, he can see them. The golden onion-shaped domes of the Kremlin. So close he feels he could touch them. One last effort, he tells himself and his frostbitten men. One final push, and the war will be over. But this mirage of victory rises from a hell of ice. The breath of his men freezes instantly, forming icicles on their beards and scarves. They are no longer an army. They are a collection of survivors on the brink of collapse. Their summer uniforms, designed for a swift summer campaign, are useless rags against a cold of 30 degrees below zero that burns exposed skin and sinks into the bones with relentless cruelty. Night is the worst enemy. The engines of the panzer tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, refuse to start. Their lubricants have turned into a thick, frozen paste. Their tracks, too narrow for the deep snow, turn them into immobile steel coffins. The soldiers burn anything to survive: fences, furniture from the few izbas they find, even empty ammunition crates. Hunger is a constant companion, a dull ache that frozen rations can barely soothe. Tens of thousands are fighting not the Red Army, but frostbite. Toes turn black inside boots. Hands swell until they are useless. Every morning, sergeants find rigid bodies at guard posts, men who simply fell asleep and never woke again. The supply line, stretched over 1,500 kilometers of hostile territory, is a thin, broken thread. Morale, though driven by the proximity of the goal, is as fragile as a sheet of ice over a deep river. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the air is thick with a controlled panic. Martial law governs the streets. Teams of citizens, mostly women and the elderly, dig anti-tank ditches in the frozen ground and erect barricades, with overturned trams and sandbags. The government has evacuated, but Stalin remains. His presence in the Kremlin is a steel anchor in a storm of fear. The city has become a fortress, preparing for a street-by-street, house-by-house fight. For the German soldiers who see the Kremlin's towers, victory seems inevitable, but they do not know they are standing on a trapdoor. They do not feel the tremor beneath the snow, nor hear the whisper of 1,000,000 men gathering in the dark forests that surround them. They are exhausted, frozen, and overextended. They are the tip of a spear that has been stretched so thin it is about to break, and the hammer is about to fall. The German plan had a name that reeked of arrogance: Operation Typhoon. It was to be the final storm, the coup de grace that would decapitate the Soviet Union and end the war in the East before winter truly took hold. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, a disciplined and efficient product of the Prussian military school, had designed a classic double pincer movement, a masterpiece of blitzkrieg. His panzer armies would encircle Moscow from the north and south, closing a gigantic pocket and annihilating the last defenders of the Bolshevik regime. On paper, the plan was flawless. On the ground, it was falling apart. First came the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud that turned Russian roads into rivers of mire that swallowed trucks, horses, and men. The advance slowed to a crawl. And then, when the mud finally froze, an even more formidable enemy arrived: General Winter. Von Bock, from his headquarters, saw the looming catastrophe. His reports were a litany of desperate warnings. Troops lacked winter clothing, vehicles were failing, casualties from frostbite were exceeding those from combat. His frontline generals, men like Heinz Guderian, the father of the Lightning War, pleaded for permission to halt, to withdraw to a defensible line, and prepare for winter. But their pleas hit a wall of fanatical obstinacy. Hundreds of kilometers away, in the safety of his bunker in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler refused to accept reality. For him, war was not fought with logistics and weather considerations, but with sheer force of will. "The cold is an excuse," he screamed at his generals. "The will of the German soldier will overcome the winter." He forbade any kind of retreat. He forbade the construction of defensive positions. The only order was to advance. Always advance. This disconnect between the high command and the reality at the front was total. Hitler saw maps where divisions were blue arrows advancing inexorably. Von Bock saw men with faces gray from exhaustion and cold, struggling to take another step in waist-deep snow. The Wehrmacht believed the Red Army was finished. They had captured millions of prisoners, destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft. They assumed the Soviets had no organized reserves left. It was the greatest miscalculation of the war. They underestimated the vastness of Russia and the almost superhuman ability of its people to endure suffering. And above all, they underestimated the cunning of their adversary. While the Germans froze in the open, the Soviets were conducting a massive, secret troop movement, a logistical feat that would change the fate of the world. The true turning point did not occur on a snow-covered battlefield, but in the tense silence of the Kremlin. It was not an ultimatum delivered under a white flag, but the stark reality of the German situation. Army Group Center, the most powerful invasion force ever assembled, was paralyzed, bled white, frozen, incapable of delivering the final blow. And that was precisely the moment Army General Georgy Zhukov had been waiting for. Zhukov was the polar opposite of the aristocratic German field marshals. The son of peasants, he was a man forged in the brutality of the Civil War and Stalin's purges. His will was granite, his pragmatism ruthless. He cared not for tactical subtleties, he cared for results. Stalin used him as his personal fireman, sending him to the most desperate sectors of the front to extinguish fires with relentless ferocity. And now, the greatest fire of all was burning at the gates of the capital. For weeks, while directing a tenacious and bloody defense, Zhukov had been amassing a secret. Far from the eyes of German reconnaissance planes, in the forests east of Moscow, he had assembled a new army. These were the Siberian divisions, elite troops, hardened by the eye, winters of the Far East, men who knew how to fight and survive in the extreme cold. The decision to bring these divisions from the Manchurian border was one of Stalin's greatest gambles. It was based on the intelligence of one man, Richard Sorge, his master spy in Tokyo. Sorge, posing as a Nazi journalist, had confirmed from within the inner circle of the German embassy that Imperial Japan, despite its pact with Germany, would not attack the Soviet Union. Its focus was south, towards the oil of Southeast Asia and the US fleet at Pearl Harbor. With his back secured, Stalin gave the green light. Train after train, crossing a continent, the Siberian divisions arrived in Moscow. They were fully equipped for winter warfare, padded uniforms, felt boots, skis for mobility, and most importantly, the new and formidable T-34 tanks, whose superior design and wide tracks made them immune to the cold and snow that paralyzed the panzers. In a tense meeting in the Kremlin, Zhukov spread his maps. Before Stalin, he pointed to the thin, overextended German line. He explained how the enemy was at its weakest point. He proposed not a simple counterattack to relieve pressure, but a massive strategic counteroffensive designed to shatter the flanks of Army Group Center and trigger its collapse. It was an all-or-nothing bet. If it failed, nothing would be left to defend Moscow. Stalin, convinced by Zhukov's iron confidence and Sorge's intelligence, nodded. Proceed. The secret order was issued to the front commanders. The offensive would begin at dawn on December 5th. The hammer, forged in secret and silence, was about to fall on the frozen anvil. The 96 hours that broke the back of the Wehrmacht began in the pre-dawn darkness of December 5th, 1941. A violent blizzard was raging across the front, an unexpected ally that masked the movement of hundreds of thousands of men. North of Moscow, General Ivan Konev's front was unleashed upon the German Ninth Army. The attack began with a sound the Germans had never heard before, a supernatural howl, a roar that seemed to tear the sky apart. It was Stalin's organs, the Katyusha rocket launcher batteries, firing salvos that turned the frozen German positions into a hell of fire and shrapnel. The men, shivering in their foxholes, were annihilated before they could even react. On December 6th, the main weight of Zhukov's attack struck northwest of the capital. It was then that the Germans saw the ghosts. From the snow-covered forests, in almost complete silence, emerged figures clad in white. They moved swiftly, gliding on skis, flanking German positions, appearing suddenly in their rear, sowing panic and death with their submachine guns. These were the Siberian troops in their element, hunters in a white wilderness. Alongside them advanced the T-34s. For the crews of the Panzer IIIs and IVs, it was a soul-crushing sight. Their own shells bounced harmlessly off the sloped armor of the Soviet tanks. In contrast, the T-34's 76mm guns sliced through German steel as if it were butter. The T-34s did not get stuck in the deep snow. They rode over it, crushing machine gun nests and anti-tank guns under their wide tracks. German technological superiority, the pillar of the Blitzkrieg, had evaporated in the Russian cold. A German veteran would later describe the horror. "We saw the Russian tanks coming, and our infantry just turned and ran. There was nothing we could do. Our guns were useless. It was the beginning of the end." Panic is a virus, and it spread through the German lines with terrifying speed. Communications were cut. Units lost contact with each other. The coherent front of Army Group Center began to disintegrate into isolated pockets of desperate resistance. By December 7th, the third day, the withdrawal had turned into a chaotic rout. It was no longer a military operation, but a race for survival. Soldiers abandoned everything they could not carry: heavy artillery, trucks, tanks. The road back to Smolensk became a graveyard of German equipment. Partisans, emboldened by the offensive and following Stalin's torch order to burn any potential shelter, attacked the retreating columns, adding misery to misery. On December 8th, at von Bock's headquarters, the fog of war finally lifted to reveal the full scale of the disaster. This was not a local counterattack. It was a full-blown strategic offensive, launched with a strength the Red Army was not thought to possess. The very spearhead units that, just 4 days earlier, had been gazing at the Kremlin were now fighting desperately to avoid being encircled and annihilated. The strategic initiative, for the first time in the Second World War, had decisively passed from German to Soviet hands. The storm of Operation Typhoon had turned on its creators. The shockwave from the Moscow counteroffensive traveled up the entire German chain of command to the Eagle's Nest. News of the collapse of Army Group Center threw Hitler into a state of rage and denial. While his generals at the front pleaded for permission for an orderly withdrawal to a shorter, more defensible winter line, Hitler saw only treason and cowardice. Enraged, he issued one of his most fateful and brutal orders: hold positions at all costs. He forbade any retreat under penalty of court-martial. Units were to dig in where they stood and resist to the last man. This decision was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it likely prevented a total collapse and a complete disintegration of the front, like the one suffered by Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812. The iron discipline of the Wehrmacht held, and the retreat, though chaotic, did not become a total rout. But the price of this order was terrible. By forcing his men to defend untenable, exposed, and unprepared positions, he condemned them to a slow, freezing death. Entire units were encircled and annihilated. Casualties soared. Soldiers died by the thousands, not just from enemy fire, but from cold and starvation in open trenches that offered no shelter. The purge of the high command was immediate and ruthless. Hitler, seeking scapegoats for his own strategic failure, fired his most experienced commanders. Field Marshal von Bock was relieved of command of Army Group Center. General Guderian, the Panzer genius, was dismissed for conducting a withdrawal to save his men. In all, more than 35 high-ranking generals were fired within weeks. Hitler, believing only his will could save the situation, assumed personal command of the army. The psychological impact was, perhaps, the most profound and lasting. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility, carefully built through lightning victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans, was shattered in the snows of Moscow. For the first time, the German soldier had been decisively beaten. They saw their comrades flee in panic. They saw their superior tanks outmatched. They felt the terror of being hunted by an enemy they thought they had vanquished. Doubt and pessimism settled into the hearts of the soldiers, a wound that would never fully heal. For the rest of the world, the news was electrifying. Nazi Germany was not invincible. The Blitzkrieg could be stopped. At Moscow, the tide of the war had begun to turn. For the rest of December and well into January 1942, the Red Army steamroller continued to advance. They pushed the exhausted and decimated German armies westward, driving them back 100 to 250 kilometers from the capital. The direct threat to Moscow was eliminated forever. The front would only stabilize in the spring, when the thaw once again turned the land into a sea of mud, exhausting the momentum of both armies. The final numbers of the Battle of Moscow are a testament to the apocalyptic scale of the fighting on the Eastern Front. From the start of Operation Typhoon in October to the end of the Soviet counteroffensive in January, the Wehrmacht suffered over 500,000 casualties. The Red Army, true to its doctrine of victory at any price, suffered even greater losses, with some estimates approaching 1 million men. But there was a crucial difference. The Soviet Union, with its vast reserves of manpower, could absorb those losses and fight on. Germany could not. In the long term, the defeat at Moscow was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. It marked the failure of the Blitzkrieg strategy. The war in the East would not be a short, decisive campaign, but a long, brutal, total war of attrition, a type of conflict for which Germany was neither economically nor demographically prepared. Every soldier, every tank, every plane lost on the frozen plains of Russia was irreplaceable. Stalin's and Zhukov's secret decision to risk everything on a massive counteroffensive did not just save their capital. It changed the course of history. It proved to the world that Nazi tyranny could be defeated. It solidified the Eastern Front as the decisive theater of the war in Europe, where the bulk of the Wehrmacht would be bled to death in the years to come. The towers of the Kremlin, which once seemed a prize within reach, became the symbol of the hubris and ultimate catastrophe of Hitler's Germany. Victory had a terrible price, but in those 96 frozen hours, the Soviet Union ensured its survival and sealed the fate of its invaders.